In the quiet hours after sunset, when the air was cool and misty, a young weaver named May walked down the winding path that led to her village. Her fingers were stiff from the day's work at her loom, each movement of threading and weaving etched into the fabric of time. She passed through the herbalist's back room on her way home, where Old Yu was still sorting his dried roots under a dim light. "May," he called out softly, "will you stay for a moment?" She entered, closing the door behind her to keep out the chill. The herbalist's shelves were lined with rows of jars and boxes filled with leaves, bark, and seeds. An earthy scent filled the air, mingling with the faint smell of damp wood from outside. "Something is troubling you," you observed quietly as he leaned over a small scale. May looked down at her worn hands, still clutching the cloth she had just finished weaving. "I fear my work will never be enough." You nodded thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before speaking again. "The weavers in the village talk of grand designs and patterns that speak to beauty and luxury. But what I weave is plain, for those who need simple cloth." Old Yu set down his tools and came around to sit beside her on a low stool. He reached into one of the jars and pulled out a small handful of red seeds. "These seeds," he said quietly, "they grow in the meadows beyond our village. They are not the most beautiful or sought after, but they serve a purpose. Each seed holds within it life, just as each thread you weave." May's eyes met his for a moment, and then she looked away at her hands. "I am tired of feeling I am less than," she admitted softly. You placed his hand gently on hers. "Is there not value in the work that serves others? In giving what is needed?" She nodded, her gaze moving back to the door where light from outside was growing fainter as night settled in. "Sometimes it feels like the world does not care if my thread is part of their cloth," May confessed. The herbalist smiled and squeezed her hand. "Perhaps it cares more than you think." Outside, a soft wind began to stir, carrying whispers through the evening air. Yu rose from his stool, his movements slow and deliberate. He went to the door and opened it just enough for May to see the night beyond, dark but alive with unseen possibilities. The herbalist held out his hand again, this time offering her something wrapped in a small piece of paper. "For tomorrow," he said quietly. "To remind you that every thread has its place." May looked at him, then took the parcel and slipped it into her pocket. "Thank you, Yu." She paused, unsure if she should say more. Then simply, with a small smile, added, "I will think on your words tonight." The door closed behind her as she left for home, her steps lighter than before under the soft moonlight. The herbalist watched until she was out of sight, then returned to his shelves and his work. Inside, the quiet continued, broken only by the gentle click of Yu's scale measuring herbs, each one chosen with care for its purpose, whether small or grand, in the world beyond.
You're listening to the Empty Teahouse. Somewhere across the village, a loom began to creak softly in the night. Under the silver light of the moon, Chen walked along the riverbank where boats were pulled up for the night.
Under the silver light of the moon, Chen walked along the riverbank where boats were pulled up for the night. Winter had come early this year, and a thin layer of ice crunched beneath his feet as he moved quietly through the stillness. A solitary boat rested near the water's edge, its sails folded and ropes neatly coiled. From inside one of the huts nearby, Chen heard the sound of someone singing softly, a woman's voice, sweet but low. The song was unfamiliar, perhaps a lullaby for her children who might be asleep within. He paused by the boat, considering whether to knock on the wooden door before him or continue his walk downriver. The door creaked open slowly, and Li appeared. She had known Chen when he lived here years ago. They exchanged pleasantries briefly about the weather and the state of the river. As they talked, Chen noticed a small basket hanging from one wall, filled with dried fish and other provisions. Lee pointed to the boat. "You could spend the night there if you wish. It's cold." "Thank you," he said, feeling the sudden weight of his years away from home. She nodded at him and then turned back inside her hut, closing the door quietly behind her. The moonlight washed over Chen as he climbed into the boat, settling in for what promised to be a chilly night. He pulled out a blanket and wrapped it around himself, lying down on the hard wooden bench below deck where lantern light barely reached. In the early hours of dawn, Chen woke up stiff but clear-headed. The world seemed paused in this moment between dark and light. On impulse, he got out of the boat to see if Lee had left any sign that she needed help, perhaps with a load or some task for another day. To his surprise, she was standing by her door, watching him leave. "You were here again," she said gently, almost as if speaking to herself rather than him. He nodded, not sure what else to say. Then he saw the basket of dried fish sitting just outside her door on a small table. "It's for you," Lee explained quietly, pointing at it with an unsmiling smile. "Take it." Chen hesitated, then took hold of the basket carefully, feeling its weight in his hands as if carrying the seasons themselves between 2 points that met and separated again without ever changing much underneath the surface. "Thank you," he said softly. She watched him walk back to where he'd left a bag with his clothes for the day. When he was halfway across the clearing, Chen looked over his shoulder one last time. Lee was standing there in her doorway, watching too, but now she seemed less like an old friend and more like a figure from another time, slightly out of reach. He continued on towards home, the sound of footsteps breaking into the silence, then fading again as he disappeared around a bend in the riverbank path.
Somewhere across the river, a dog barked into the dark. At dusk, the village tea house was quiet save for the soft clinking of porcelain cups and the occasional murmur from a corner where 3 men shared their day's stories.
At dusk, the village tea house was quiet save for the soft clinking of porcelain cups and the occasional murmur from a corner where 3 men shared their day's stories. The air outside was chilled, and a light drizzle dampened the cobblestones as an old man shuffled in, clutching his walking stick. He wore a coat patched with darker squares, each stitch telling its own story of wear and repair. His face, framed by wisps of white hair, bore the weight of many winters. The old man moved slowly toward the tea house's edge, where a small, wooden bench sat under an awning that shielded it from rain. A young girl about 10 years old saw him coming and watched him with her eyes wide, the way children do when they sense something beyond their understanding. She was sitting at a corner table drinking hot tea with her grandmother, who often took her there for quiet evenings of conversation and warmth. "Wait," said the old man to no one in particular as he stopped halfway between his spot and the bench. He looked around him, then back toward the girl and her grandmother. The girl noticed this attention and turned from her cup, returning his gaze with a polite nod. The old man limped over to their table, eyeing it carefully before settling into an empty chair that no one had claimed. The grandmother's face softened as she saw the struggle in his steps. She did not speak, but her expression invited him to share whatever was on his mind. "I've been walking all day," he began, his voice a whisper of dry leaves and autumn wind. "And now I'm too tired even to stand." The girl put down her cup and looked at him more closely, her gaze unflinching despite the discomfort she felt seeing him struggle so visibly. "Please stay here," said the grandmother, pouring another cup from the pot set before them. She pushed it toward him gently with 2 fingers, as if handling a fragile flower that might break in a strong wind. The old man accepted the tea without words, his hands shaking slightly as he raised the cup to his lips. He drank slowly, letting each sip warm him from within. As night fell and the tea house filled with more patrons seeking refuge from the rain, the grandmother turned back to her granddaughter and said quietly, "It's time." The girl understood that her part was to help. She left her seat without a word and returned with an old blanket folded neatly on her arm. As she approached him, The old man's eyes met hers briefly before he looked down at his hands. She draped the blanket over his shoulders carefully, tucking it around him like a shield against the chill. He reached up to grasp the edge of it in thanks, his fingers brushing hers lightly as he did so. The grandmother stood then and spoke softly to her granddaughter once more. "Now we'll let him rest." They left the old man to himself at their corner table, watching over him only with quiet concern as they made their way back home. The tea house's lanterns cast shadows that danced along the walls and floor, turning the space into a silent world of fleeting shapes. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the night air was still cold. As they stepped out into it, the grandmother shivered slightly, and the girl wrapped her arms around herself, though there were no words exchanged about their actions or feelings tonight. They walked together through the dark village until home appeared ahead of them in a small glow from an open window. The old man remained behind, his presence felt but no longer seen, as they disappeared into the warmth of their house for the night.
The lantern flame flickered as if pausing to remember the quiet kindness shared within. In the quiet of a hillside terrace after a storm, Old Manly sat by the edge where rows of young tea plants stretched into the distance.
In the quiet of a hillside terrace after a storm, Old Manly sat by the edge where rows of young tea plants stretched into the distance. The sky was still heavy with gray clouds that refused to let go of their water, but there were small breaks allowing for glimpses of blue and light. Beside him appeared young girl May, holding a bowl of hot soup wrapped in a cloth like a baby. She set it down next to Lee without speaking and sat beside him, looking out over the tea fields. The wind carried off the smell of rain-soaked earth mixed with steam from her soup. Lee reached for the bowl but paused mid-reach, his hand lingering above its warmth before turning back to look at May. May said softly, "You always liked this soup when you were young." He nodded and took a sip. It was hot and filled with flavors that tasted of home. Ginger and green onions and small bits of meat and vegetables he couldn't quite distinguish but which all blended into something comforting. "You've made it better than before," Lee said, sipping again to give her his full attention. May smiled faintly, eyes downcast. "It's just how you taught me." They sat in silence for a while longer, the soup cooling slowly as they watched water droplets roll off leaves like tiny teardrops. The sun started peering through gaps in the clouds, painting golden streaks across wet tea plants. "You never did much with yourself," Lee said finally, his voice soft and unaccusing. May's shoulders rose slightly then fell back down again as she looked up at him. "I have this place." He turned to her fully now, not missing how she had held on to what he gave her all those years ago, the teachings of growing tea and making soup. "You are patient," Lee said quietly. He patted the ground beside him with a gnarled hand and May scooted closer. "And you are kind." May handed him another cup of hot water for his tea, pouring it carefully without spilling. It made him think of all she had learned from watching. "Will you stay here now?" he asked. She nodded, fingers curling around the edge of her bowl, like a familiar hold on what was hers to keep. "And will I still have someone to make my soup?" A small laugh escaped her this time, a sound between breath and whisper. "Always." The clouds thinned out some more, making way for patches of blue sky above them. Lee leaned back against the earth behind him, closing his eyes as he breathed in deeply. When May left after another long while of quiet observation, it was with just her soup bowl and her steps on damp ground echoing softly away from where they sat. As she disappeared around a corner of tea plant rows, Lee opened one eye to watch until her form vanished entirely before letting out his own breath in a deep sigh. At the end of their day together, both were left with more than just shared silence. Each had carried forward another day's worth of understanding and warmth from those quiet moments.
The last light caught the tips of the tea leaves, glowing briefly before fading. On a chilly autumn night, beneath a crescent moon and stars that shone with an eerie clarity, two travelers rested at a modest shrine by the side of a winding road.
On a chilly autumn night, beneath a crescent moon and stars that shone with an eerie clarity, two travelers rested at a modest shrine by the side of a winding road. The shrine was tucked between tall trees whose leaves whispered secrets in the wind. Outside, the world was asleep. Inside, there was only quiet. One traveler was an old salt merchant from beyond the hills, his face etched with lines that spoke of years spent under harsh sun and starlight. He had paused at this shrine for rest, finding solace in its stillness. Beside him sat a young woman who had been walking through the night, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon where a city awaited. She was not tired but rather seemed to be listening deeply, as if to the far-off hum of life. The merchant had noticed her earlier at the next shrine down the road, standing alone and looking lost in thought. Moved by an unspoken connection, he approached her with a small bag of salt as a gesture of kindness. She accepted it without word, her hand warm against his cold fingers, and they sat together here, where others would rarely venture. For hours, neither spoke. There was no need for words, the night had woven them into something more profound than conversation could be. The wind carried with it the scent of pine needles and distant fires, adding layers to their silent companionship. As dawn began to paint the sky with hues of rose and gold, a solitary crow landed on one of the shrine's pillars, its dark silhouette stark against the lightening sky. In that moment, the merchant handed her an old book he had brought along for company during his travels. Its pages were worn and faded, but they held within them stories from across continents, tales of mountains and seas, of people who had once walked where she now stood. She took the book in both hands, her fingers tracing the edges of its cover as if discovering secrets left behind by countless hands before hers. She thanked him not with words, but with a nod that spoke volumes about her gratitude. Before they parted ways, he handed over another small package wrapped simply in paper. It was a gift from his homeland, an herb known for its restorative powers after long journeys. With it came the same quiet understanding. Sometimes the greatest comfort is found not in what one says but in acts of kindness that bridge vast distances between strangers. She watched him go with eyes filled with more than just farewell. The morning sun warmed her face as she unfolded the paper to reveal a handful of dried leaves, each one bearing traces of his journey, like footprints on a sandy shore. She pressed them gently against her chest before placing them carefully in her satchel. As she stood up and prepared to continue her own path forward, another traveler appeared on the horizon, this one hurrying towards town with baskets slung over shoulders. He paused for just a moment near their shrine before turning back onto his route, leaving behind nothing but a fleeting glance that held no words but much meaning. The young woman did not look at him. Instead, she turned to gaze into the forest where her path lay. The trees seemed to whisper an invitation as the crow flew off, disappearing into its own horizon. And so, they moved on from each other with nothing more than a shared night under the stars and gifts that spoke of journeys yet to be completed. She packed away the herb, the book still clutched in her hand, stepping forward where her path led, no longer alone but carrying with her stories and silent understandings given freely along her way.
Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled softly, its echo fading into the morning mist. The world outside was quiet as it had been throughout these hushed moments of contemplation and stillness. The empty tea house rests. Until tomorrow.